Research Insider. If you have been here last week, welcome back. So this event is co-organized by MBIOS and 100 Scientists of Malaysia with our scientific media partner, Science Media Center Malaysia. So I'm Josh. I do PhD in cognitive neuroscience at UON. And we have here with Aleya Mazuki, who works in Cambridge on the topic of learning and decision in OCD in adolescents. And yeah, so over to you, Aleya.
Yeah, sure. So I'll begin right away. 1 second. Hi, my name is Aleya, and I am a current PhD student in the University of Cambridge, and I'm doing a PhD in psychology. So thank you everyone for joining us for MBIOS Research Insider 2. And this week I'll be presenting a brief look into a PhD in psychology. So essentially what I'll be talking about first is my background and education journey, so how I got to be in a psychology program. And then I'll talk a little bit about what my research background is. So long story short, it's about OCD, but I'll be expanding more on what OCD is. And then I'll be talking about basically what I study and how I study it in a lab setting. I'll start off with talking a little bit about my education journey. I started off, of course, in secondary school. I did SPM in a school called Sri Utama, which is a very small school located in Setapak, Kuala Lumpur. Not many people have heard of it. This was me, fresh-faced in high school. And then I moved on to do A-levels after that. So I did A-levels in a college called College Yayasan UEM. And while I was there, I actually didn't know at first what I wanted to pursue in university. I had dreams of pursuing maybe journalism or English literature, but I wasn't quite sure yet. But then I took psychology A-level and I found it really, really interesting actually. So that's what I ended up applying for in university. So the A-levels I did were mathematics, English literature, psychology, and I did half an A-level in biology. I had 18 months to do my A-levels instead of the full 2 years because I was on a very rushed program. So this was me trying to complete my assignments every day because it was very, very grueling. And somehow I made it to university. I am now doing, back then I was doing a bachelor's degree in psychology. And I did it in University College London. It's a very nice university here. So during my time in UCL, I kind of knew from towards the end of first year, beginning of second year, that I wanted to do something related to mental health and related to research. So I pursued modules related to clinical psychology, neuroscience, because I knew I wanted to do something a bit more biological, a bit more related to mental health. And in my third year, I actually undertook a dissertation in a neuroscience lab, specifically with rats. So there's me with the rats in our lab, and there's more pictures of the rodents. And I really like animals, so I really enjoyed working with them. And the dissertation I did in UCL in my final year, it actually has nothing to do with the PhD that I'm doing right now. So that's all to say that it doesn't matter kind of what sort of research you're going into at first when you're still an undergraduate, because a lot of research skills you're doing when you're still a junior researcher are very transferable. So you'll be able to do what you want to do later on in the future regardless. And also while I was in UCL, I undertook a bunch of internships, mostly within research labs. I did them in Malaysia and I also did them in the UK. And I also did 1 summer in a clinical psychology unit in Hospital Kuala Lumpur, so in the government hospital in Kuala Lumpur, which was really interesting. And somehow I managed to graduate, so that's good. And then I moved on to doing a postgraduate degree in Cambridge. So my Cambridge journey was quite interesting actually, because I started off pursuing a master's in psychology in Cambridge. So this is Cambridge here. Here are some pictures I took of the buildings in the snow because I think it's really pretty. And this is my college, which is Downing College. So at first I was on the master's program in Cambridge, and I was really interested in pursuing a PhD afterwards. So I applied for a PhD program within the same lab with the same supervisor. But as a lot of you probably already know, it's very, very hard to get funding as an international student doing a PhD degree within the UK. So a lot of the funding is available for local students, but not so much for the international students. So as a result, I applied and I applied. I think I applied to over 15 or 20 funding bodies, and I couldn't get anything, even though I did manage to get into the PhD program in Cambridge. So that was quite disheartening at first. But my supervisor wanted me to stay on and actually complete the project I started off with in my master's. So he kind of cut me a deal. He told me that he had some funding for a research assistant / PhD student. And he said that it's for 2 years. So what I would effectively have to do is to kind of not graduate from my master's program, but go straight into a PhD program. So essentially the master's program would be the first year of my PhD, and then I would spend another 2 years working on the project as a PhD student. And in return, I would get funding from his grant as a research assistant and psychology student. So I do get a stipend just enough to sort of let me live in Cambridge. And also a good thing about this deal is that I don't need to pay the exorbitant fees that international students have to pay as PhD students. That's because as a research student, I'm partly staff. So I'm a staff member of the university alongside a PhD student. So because of that, I get a discount on the tuition fees. So I only have to pay £2,000 versus the 27,000 nonsense that PhD students normally have to pay. So that's really good. And the reason why I'm talking quite a bit about this is because I know it's so difficult for people to get funding, even though they're so passionate about doing postgraduate degrees. And this is one avenue I found that is quite unusual. And I think this could be a viable option for other people as well. So check maybe if your university that you're applying to has schemes like this where you can be a staff member, maybe a teaching assistant, maybe a research assistant alongside being a PhD student. Yep, so this is me now in Cambridge, living out my Hogwarts fantasies that we all have. So now that my education background's out of the way, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I'm actually researching. So what I research is obsessive-compulsive disorder. So this is a very debilitating psychiatric condition, and it's characterized by these debilitating intrusive thoughts, which are obsessions, as well as repetitive rituals that they feel compelled to perform, and these are the compulsions. And worldwide, 1 to 2% of the world's population is affected by OCD. And you know that's 1 in 100 people or 2 in 100 people. And the exact statistics for Malaysia are unfortunately unknown, but it's thought to be the same. So in a population of 31 million Malaysians, that's around 600,000 Malaysians currently suffering from OCD. So the odds are you probably know someone who is suffering from the disorder. So what are some of the common obsessions that people with OCD face? So again, to remind you, these are the intrusive thoughts that people go through. Here's a list of them. A very common one that is often presented in the media is this sort of fear of contamination, fear that you're dirty or impure, fear of contracting a disorder or a disease. But there are lots of other types of obsessions as well. So there's obsessions surrounding harm. So the fear that you might harm someone, you might lose control. So losing control is also very related to harm, and end up harming your family, maybe accidentally, maybe on purpose. And there's also the fear that someone may harm you. So a lot of people with OCD, they have fears that someone will break into their house and cause them harm in some way. So that's why a lot of people with OCD have checking compulsions where they have to check the locks over and over again to see that their house is definitely locked. Then there are obsessions related to symmetry, so needing everything to be just right, just symmetrical. And then the two obsessions that aren't very spoken about are for one, sexual obsessions. So these are obsessions typically surrounding these thoughts that are completely unwanted, but you have thoughts that you may do something inappropriate in a sexual way, potentially to people who are not consenting. So they have this fear that they are somehow an offender, they might accidentally assault someone, even though in no way is that true. And there are lastly religious obsessions, and these are obsessions surrounding fear of angering a deity or angering God in some way, a fear of committing blasphemy. And something interesting I've always thought about obsessions is that obsessions seem to manifest according to what current event is going on in the world or according to what is very important to the person at any given point. So as an example, a few decades ago, when the AIDS crisis, so AIDS was at its peak, there was a rise in people with OCD reporting extreme obsessions and fears of contracting AIDS or HIV. And then a few years after that, well, very recently actually, with the Me Too movement that's going around, where lots of high profile people are being accused of sexual offenses, people with OCD started having more sexual obsessions, so fears that they may one day be called out as a sexual offender, even though, again, those fears are completely unfounded. So I've always thought that was interesting. And then now with coronavirus going around, I wouldn't be surprised if many people with OCD now have their obsessions centered on getting COVID. And now what are the compulsions? So the compulsions tend to be very linked to the obsessions that people have. For example, if you have obsessions about contamination, you tend to do a lot of washing. Again, I mentioned that if you have fears of people harming you, you're going to check things to make sure nothing's in the way that will harm you. And then what people don't realize is that a lot of the compulsions actually occur in the mind. So even though people may not seem to be having the typical OCD sort of traits that are presented by the media, a lot of the compulsions may be happening in the mind. For example, actively counting or actively thinking very repetitive thoughts to drown out the obsessions. And what's quite sad is that half of all cases of OCD begin in late childhood or adolescence. And, you know, as a teenager, it's already hard enough going through school, developing as an adult, while also having to deal with the mental torture that comes along with having OCD. But I just wanted to highlight that in popular media, compulsions such as hand washing and maybe arranging things and making things all neat, those things are highlighted much more than the obsessions. But in actuality, the obsessions that people go through actually cause a great deal of anxiety. And I just wanted to play maybe 30 seconds of this video just to highlight what that's like living in the mind of someone who has OCD. So we'll just see if this video plays. Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay, I'm going to stop it there. I hope you could all hear it. The subtitles weren't great, sorry about that, because they're automatically generated. So you can see here that you can kind of pick up some of the obsessions and compulsions he has that I mentioned in the previous slide. So a lot of his obsessions tend to be centered around health, right? He has fears that he has Ebola, and I think this video came out when the Ebola crisis was at its peak. And in order to combat these obsessive thoughts about Ebola, he did his compulsions, which comprised of checking. So he checked the internet to check his symptoms. And he also checked his temperature. And also, if we go watch the video a bit longer, he actually checks his blood pressure over and over again at one point. And this kind of reinforces this negative cycle whereby having these intrusive thoughts lead you to do all this checking, and all this checking makes you even more anxious. And when you're even more anxious, you're going to be having more of these intrusive thoughts. And when you have these thoughts, of course, you start doing your compulsions again. So a lot of people with OCD, they tend to be trapped in this very, very negative loop. Right, so that's a bit of background out of the way. And if you all have more questions about OCD later on, I'd be happy to answer them. I'm going to be talking now about my life in the laboratory and how I actually study OCD. The aims of my PhD currently are to understand how OCD in teenagers affects their learning and decision making. So this is my main sort of PhD topic. I also have a separate project as a research assistant, whereby I'm looking to find out which brain networks are very affected in people with OCD, especially when they're under stress, when they're experiencing their symptoms. So I'll talk a little bit about the first one. How does OCD affect learning and decision making? To answer this question, I kind of need to explain what we mean by learning, first of all. And a very simplified way of looking at it that we study in the lab is something called probabilistic learning. So learning from probabilities. So what we do is we sit a participant in front of a laptop, and then we show them two images. So for example, an apple and an orange on the screen. And then we tell them you have to select either the apple or the orange on a given round. And then you will either be rewarded some money, or there is a chance that you'll be given nothing for your choice. And we tell them that one option is actually more advantageous than the other option, and it's their job to find out which option is the better option. Unbeknownst to the participants, there is an algorithm underlying how the rewards are given to them. So for the apple, we program it so that there's an 80% chance of them getting a reward, for example, 80% chance of getting 1 ringgit. Whereas there's a 20% chance of them getting nothing if they select the apple. Whereas for the orange, there's only a 20% chance they will get 1 ringgit every time they select it, and an 80% chance they'll get nothing. So after people do this for a while, they quickly gather that the apple would be the better option than the orange, so they stick to pressing the apple. So that's in healthy people, but what about people who have OCD? So in the video I showed earlier, the man went around his house and he had lots of uncertainty, lots of doubt about how he's feeling, about whether he's healthy or not. And it's interesting that people with OCD have all this doubt, even though there's a lot of evidence in the environment suggesting that they're fine. So he had no signs of Ebola, no symptoms, but he wasn't using that evidence to make himself feel better. So people with OCD, they have all this evidence, but they don't rely on it. And then how does this translate to the game I just mentioned? So in the game, you get feedback, right? Either you get money or you don't. So we're finding that people with OCD, they don't use this reward information to drive their choices. So even though the apple is obviously more rewarding than the orange, they don't rely on this information to make their choices. Instead, there's a sort of distrust of the feedback. They think like, oh, this can't be trusted. I have to like keep trying lots of different options before I can be really, really sure. And because they act this way on games like this, they take a longer time to actually reach a decision that is optimal. And while they're spending all their time trying to figure out which is better, apple or orange, they do a lot more exploration, is what it's called. They explore the choices more than people without OCD. Because people without OCD, they would try the apple a bit, try the orange a bit, and then stick to the apple. Whereas people with OCD, they would keep exploring, they would keep going back and forth, back and forth. So you can imagine this makes daily life a lot more difficult because it takes a long time for them to make decisions. And you can imagine that if you're in a school setting or if you're in a career or office setting, if you need to churn out work as quickly as possible, that will be very difficult for people with OCD to do because they have all these doubts in their head that stop them from making decisions that are good. How I study this further, this phenomenon of learning and decision making, is one, as I mentioned, using computer games. So computer games very, very similar to the apple and the orange example that I mentioned before. And I also use something called skin conductance measures, which are sweat measures. So here's an example of a participant in our lab playing one of the computer games that we're giving him. So this is a space-themed game. And while he's playing this game, we also have him hooked up to a laptop that is measuring his sweat levels. So this is a closer look at that laptop, and this is the whole setup that we have. You can ask me more about how this works later on if you're interested. So essentially, people with OCD, they tend to have quite a bit more anxiety than people do generally. And you can pick this up during the sweat levels by looking at the sweat levels. So we're interested in seeing whether maybe anxiety, which is measured through sweat levels, kind of impairs performance in some way on learning games. So after we've collected this data, how exactly do we analyze it to answer our very interesting questions? So I use a statistical technique called computational modeling. And computational modeling is a concept that's thrown around quite a bit nowadays, especially with coronavirus. A lot of scientists are rushing to create models that can be used to understand the rate of infection of coronavirus. But what does that actually mean? What is a model? We actually use straight line models a lot of the time in daily life. So a model is essentially a way of describing your data and predicting how your data will behave later on. So a lot of naturally occurring phenomena can be explained using a straight line model, such as what you see here. And this model can be defined by the equation that we've all learned in high school, which is y equals mx plus c. So for example, if you have weight against height, height against weight rather, you can use a straight line model to check the extent of the relationship between these two variables. So that's a very simple example of what a model is. But how do you model something a bit more complex, a bit more abstract, which in this case is how quickly people learn or how well people learn? So there are a bunch of algorithms out there to do that. One of the algorithms that I use in my research is called the Rescorla-Wagner model. So this model looks a little bit more complicated, well, a lot more complicated than this model here, right? So I won't be delving too much into it, but essentially this model is trying to describe how people assign values to their choices. So for example, with the apple and the orange again, this model is trying to kind of predict how people assign the values to either the apple or the orange. So starting off, your value assigned, shown by the V variable here, for both of the options will be equal at first because you don't know which is more valuable than the other. But as you keep collecting rewards, you will update your value for every choice. So over time, the value of apple will go up, whereas the value for orange will go down. And typically you would use your internal representations of the values of each choice in order to guide your decisions. And the idea is that perhaps in OCD, they don't update their values per choice as efficiently as people without OCD, because potentially of all this uncertainty and doubt about which is correct and which is wrong. Right, so that's a very brief overview of what I do in terms of the learning and decision making part of my project. I lastly just want to talk a little bit about my research assistant project, because I think it's quite interesting. So what I'm looking is brain networks in people who have OCD. What we do is we scan them in a big fancy scanner here. And I'm particularly interested in seeing how brain regions in a network behave when people with OCD have their symptoms triggered. So we do this very, very basically by showing them pictures of images that are designed to trigger their symptoms. So things like dirty plates, or people checking things, or pictures of disease. So we have them in the scanner, we have them seeing these images. And then typically what you find in OCD in sort of standard experiments like this is you get regions of activation and inactivation. So in a typical OCD subject, you would see you would see increased activity in the medial frontal area and lower activity in the lateral frontal area, and also increased activity in the anterior cingulate cortex and the basal ganglia. So this is a very typical experiment with typical output, right? You just see which brain region is more active and which brain region is inactive. But I'm interested in taking that one step further. I don't just want to see which brain regions are active and inactive at a time. I want to look at networks. So networks are a very sort of beautiful way of looking at the brain. So here is a connectome of a healthy subject, whereby all the regions that are the same color are regions in a network. And then if you compare that with a subject with OCD, you can see the network isn't as neat as the person without OCD. And in fact, there are networks here that seem to be brought up. And you can ask me again a bit about this more, but essentially the basal ganglia seems to be more connected to the cerebellum compared to someone without OCD. And an implication of doing network models of OCD is that we can find which brain regions in a network are linked to the symptomatology of OCD. So that could be maybe a new target for a drug intervention. And also knowing how a brain region behaves in a network, you can also make more finely tailored treatment to sort of help someone who's suffering from OCD. And that's about it. So I have covered just a brief overview of what I'm doing currently in my projects. And yep, thank you. Let me know if you have any questions.
Cool. Thanks, Aleya. That was a very interesting presentation, and very well presented as well, like with the flat icons.
Yeah.
Very much appreciate that. So, yeah, we welcome questions, and there's a poll launched on the Zoom function as well. So if people want to check out the poll over there and put your best guess. So now we're going to move on to some questions. We've received some already via Instagram on from the 100 Scientists Instagram and the form launched by MBios. What we'll do is we'll go first with all the more general questions, and if people are interested to stick around a bit later, we can move on to the more the more technical questions or more academic oriented questions.
Sure.
So yeah, so one of the questions that came through MBios is if you knew if meditation is beneficial for OCD sufferers.
Yep. Okay, I just want to preface by saying I don't really work on treatment of OCD. So there may be someone out there better to answer this question. I have looked into it a little bit. There's more research on mindfulness as a treatment for OCD compared to, I think, traditional meditation. And it kind of makes sense that mindfulness will work because the idea of mindfulness is to if you have a thought that is upsetting or triggering in some way, the idea is you train yourself to let the thought pass by and not engage with the thought. So I can see with OCD, training yourself to not engage with the compulsion would be a very good thing for people with OCD. But I think that's a very difficult stage for patients to reach as well. So I would think that meditation techniques or mindfulness techniques may be a viable option for people who are maybe later on in their stage of recovery. But if you're really, really suffering, if your symptoms are very, very severe, then I would probably think that you would go for maybe the medication options first or the hardcore cognitive behavioral therapies first. Yeah.
Cool. And a closely related question about, say, so one of the poll questions asks, what would you do if you had a friend or met someone who had OCD? And we have four questions. And the predominant answer is we would respond with empathy to their obsessions, but don't encourage their behavior. So is that what you would recommend?
Yeah, absolutely. So no, that's great. I'm glad that people have chosen the correct option. I think the first two options are quite interesting actually, because intuitively you would think that if someone is suffering from illogical obsessions, you would want to reassure them that what you're thinking isn't true. So for example, let's say someone came up to you and was like, I think I'm a bad person. I think I'm harming everyone around me. No one wants me. Your first instinct would be to go, no, 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 that's not true. You're not like that, right? I think a lot of people would think that that would be the thing to do if someone approaches you like that. But the thing with OCD is even that asking for reassurance, whereby they go up to you and say, oh, I'm a bad person, aren't I? That's a way of them asking for reassurance. And this asking for reassurance is actually a compulsion. Because for reassurance, they're trying to get rid of the obsessions in their head. And then they get the reassurance, it calms them down for like 10 seconds, and then they go right back to thinking the intrusive thoughts again. So you're just kind of encouraging, once again, this negative cycle of obsession, compulsion, obsessive compulsion. So I think yeah, definitely the chat is correct. You should respond with empathy, like, oh, what you're feeling must be very, very difficult, but you shouldn't reassure them that they're wrong. Instead, what people with OCD have told me is that the best method is distraction. So if they start coming to you with these obsessions, you should be like, oh, okay, but let's do something else. Like, let's do something that you enjoy. Like, let's go out for a walk or let's play a video game kind of thing. Like, that is the best way to deal with someone when they're having these obsessive spirals.
Okay. And there's also a question in the chats from Julin. It's I think some question somewhat related to diagnosis of OCD. So the question reads, is there a threshold value or indicator of being overly obsessed? For example, someone has just locked the door and then they move away to do something for the next 5 minutes, then go back to the door to check the lock again. Will you categorize this as being overly obsessed or just being overly careful? So I think it's asking about the difference between obsession and being careful.
That's a good question. Yeah. So I think in order to get a diagnosis of OCD, you need to have the obsessions and the compulsions, right? And the obsessions in of themselves need to be somewhat illogical in order to get diagnosed for OCD. So if someone is locking the door because they're afraid someone will come in and then they just check 5 minutes later to make sure they locked it, then I think that's okay. But like if you're checking it 20, 30 times within an hour, then that's maladaptive already. That's already OCD-like behavior. And also when you're getting a diagnosis of OCD, the timing is a very important question that a psychiatrist will ask you. They'll ask you, okay, you do this compulsion, but how often do you do it? How much of your day does it take up? Does it take hours? Does it take minutes? And for very, very severe people, they would spend 8 hours a day on their compulsions and obsessions. And also another thing, if people who are diagnosed with OCD, they need to be suffering from the compulsions and the obsessions. So if you're checking your door once in a while and it's not really causing you any turmoil, then I think that's okay. But with people with OCD, they get very, very stressed and anxious checking over and over again. It doesn't give them any relief. It doesn't give them any pleasure.
Okay. Let's move quickly to another one. So Natsmir Lee asked, what are the genetic mutations that predispose an individual towards OCD?
Okay. I'm not a geneticist. I'll preface by saying that. There is some evidence that the serotonin transporter gene, which is the 5-HT LPR gene, I think, and I think biologists in the chat would be able to say a bit more about this, but that gene has been implicated in OCD. I think there are polymorphic variations in the gene, right? And people with OCD, they tend to show one polymorphic sort of visualization of the gene more so than others. I think they show more of the short strain of the gene. And this has been linked to OCD, but it's very, very small effects in these studies, especially in genome-wide association studies. And my friend Kai Xiang, who's in the chat, could probably tell you a bit more about that. But essentially, yeah, very, very small effects. The genes tends to be many, many genes that can code for a disorder. So it's very hard to say which single gene is the one that's causing OCD.
Okay. Yeah, sounds reasonable. But if you want further clarifications with this thing, genetics basis of psychiatric disorders, yeah, Kai Xiang would be coming on to Research Insider at some point to address this question more specifically. So Sarah Wong asked a COVID-related question. So how COVID is affecting OCD, positive, negative impact? There is anecdotally, some people are reporting that because of this COVID, right, everyone is especially more anxious. And because of that, OCD patients somehow feel a little bit somewhat validated about their thing, and whether this has validated about their concerns, and whether this would have a positive and negative effect on it. Could you speculate on this one?
Yeah. So I actually know someone with OCD. He was one of our participants in our study. And he's actually saying, like what Sarah mentioned in the chat, that he does feel a bit more relieved, validated even, because the fact that everyone is cleaner now, everyone's washing their hands, and his OCD is very linked to contamination. So he feels a bit safer somehow being in the world now that everyone is very mindful of their hygiene. And he also does feel somewhat validated. But I think the issue that he's facing and that many people with OCD are facing now is when this is all over, when people are allowed back outside now, their OCD will come back with a huge difference, because this is a very temporary sort of band-aid solution, right? So I think that is the fear right now that people with OCD are going through. And it also doesn't help that if you have compulsions related to contamination, that every piece of news media, every outlet is telling you, wash your hands, wash your hands, wash your hands. So it's as if the obsessions that were contained in your mind are now external, they're now free, and maybe you feel even more trapped by it because of that.
There's several questions in the chat, and that is related to comorbidity. So OCD is frequently confused or associated together with like other psychiatric disorders like anxiety, depression, ADHD. So do you have any insights about how we could use these methods you've mentioned, computational, functional imaging, behavioral methods? Yeah, so how you disentangle them? And the other question would be, how do you make sure that what you're recognizing is OCD and not depression or anxiety?
Okay, yeah, definitely. So OCD definitely has a lot of overlap with other disorders. So the constant fixation on one sort of thing and doing habits, that is also a commonly shared symptom of autism, right? Because with autism, they have these very narrow interests that they're constantly fixated on. And a good way to kind of tell them apart is that people with autism, they actually like their narrow interests. They're not about them, whereas people with OCD are. So that's one way you can tell them apart. And then another disorder that is commonly comorbid with is generalized anxiety disorder, anxiety. So OCD is quite different from anxiety, I feel, even though they look quite similar in how it's presented. So people with anxiety, they also have these constant thoughts about, oh no, am I a good person? What happens if this happens? What happens if this happens? What's my future gonna look like? But I think the major distinction, again, between OCD and anxiety is that people with anxiety, their obsessions or intrusive thoughts tend to be more grounded in reality. They tend to have obsessions about things that I guess are quite relatable to everyone around them. So they have exam anxiety, for instance, or anxiety about what they're going to do in the future. Will they be successful? Will I disappoint people? Whereas people with OCD, they have these more wild obsessions, I have to say. So, you know, like obsessions about, am I a sex offender, that people normally wouldn't have. So that's a distinction between them. And it takes a very, very good psychiatrist / psychologist to kind of tell the difference between all these different comorbidities and disorders. And then was there another part to the question? Like,
so this is a somewhat more research oriented question. Like I'm thinking whether the methods we're using to investigate all these disorders, so computational modeling and functional imaging of the brain, is it helpful to try and to distinguish the different types of disorder?
I think it is very useful, but the thing is, people aren't really using neuroimaging as a way to diagnose people, which I think is unfortunate, because I think the brain can tell us a lot about how a disorder is behaving. And definitely, I think, as I mentioned in my last slide, people with OCD have very, very distinct neural signatures, mainly within the medial frontal cortices and in the striatal areas, such as the basal ganglia. And these neural signatures are quite different from people with depression and people with anxiety. So if we can somehow maybe create an AI that could go through brain scans and maybe pick out which neural signature looks more like OCD and which one looks more like depression, for example, use unsupervised learning and split them, like really, really cool. But I think we're still many, many years away from that, unfortunately. So right now, the way we use to distinguish between different disorders is well, maybe not unfortunately, but through just talking to the patient and trying to suss out what their symptoms are like, and yeah, using lots of questionnaires and things. And it's really up to the psychiatrist kind of how things, yeah.
Okay. So I'm guessing we're exhausted most of the more general questions and they're moving to a bit more technical ones. So there's this one on, the skin conductance response, and Sarah asked a question about confounds, because it's the skin conductance measurement is what the popular media would call the lie detector, right? And that is something that is frequently confused, and people say that, if this measure tells me you're lying, for example. So in research, how would you control for things like confound, such as like this person has just increased tendency to sweat, or that it's confounded by other things like room temperature, etc.?
Yeah, so we definitely need to control for lots and lots of things when it comes to skin conductance, and it's not the most reliable measure, I have to be honest. So how we control for things, so we have to keep the room the exact same temperature every time when people come in. And what we do, first of all, before they start doing the games, we collect a baseline measurement of how they're just sweating normally. So we keep like the skin conductance electrodes on them for like 5-10 minutes and just see like how their behavior is, how their baseline moves. And then when we actually play the game with them, we always compare the peaks that we see to the baseline. So yeah, those are ways that you can control for the confounds.
Okay, good. Yeah. So this other question. So Jerry from Instagram asked if you use a lot of computational biology techniques, and what software or languages that you use in your modeling. And I have a related question is, so from your undergraduate training or even before that, have you used programming and all these things, and how you became how do you acquire these skills throughout your PhD to do these things?
Okay, that's a good question, because me and coding have a very complicated love-hate relationship. So I use R mostly for my modeling, R Studio, and I run my computational models at the moment in a software called JAGS, J-A-G-S, and it's also commonly used for running ecological models as well, I think. So maybe there are some biologists in the chat who have used it. So I use that. I used to use MATLAB, but I found MATLAB wasn't very reliable for some things, and JAGS made it easier to implement the kind of modeling that I wanted to do. So I moved over to JAGS. As for whether I received or did any like this sort of programming in my undergrad years, so I did a course on MATLAB for my second year. But I was so bad at it. Like, I'm not mathematically minded at all, and I found coding so difficult. And after I completed that MATLAB course, I was like, oh god, never again. And then I didn't kind of foresee that I would be ending up in a more computational heavy project. So that's been quite a surprise to me, I think. And I'm just gonna end it with, if I can do it, you can do it, because like I'm so not mathematically minded. So I think anyone can go into this more mathematical style of doing research if they put their mind to it.
Yep, cool. And I resonate with that answer as well, because I'm not mathematically minded myself, and I can't believe I chose to do it the line of work that I do now.
I know, it's crazy.
Yeah, it's crazy, right? Oh, so I guess it's also for posterity's sake, or if anyone here is a student and who is interested in doing psychology. Well, your work obviously touches a lot on mental health, psychiatric disorders, and whatnot. Has it not crossed your mind that you want to be a clinical psychologist at any point?
Yeah, so in my first year, I was kind of debating whether to go into clinical psychology or more research. I did spend a few months as a clinical psychology intern in Malaysia. And oh goodness, you need a very strong heart, very strong soul to do that line of work, because some of the things you see and some of the patients you see suffering, it really breaks your heart. And I feel like I don't know how much I can help these people face to face, but if I can help them through research, through developing treatments, through finding out why they're suffering, then I think that's more where I don't know, my responsibility lies compared to being a clinical psychologist. But I really look up to them. I think you need to be a very strong person to be a clinical psychologist.
Yeah, that is really true. That I echo that sentiment as well. And a closely related question, or somewhat addressed already, Ayapa asked in the chats, as a researcher in this field, do you get affected by your research, and do you sometimes feel insecure and assume that you have OCD as well? How do you cope? Is that ever a concern?
I think I've been maybe more mindful of my privilege as someone who is neurotypical. I feel, I don't know, like I see how people with OCD go about their day and how much they're suffering. And I've heard firsthand from participants as well. And even though I can resonate a little bit with maybe some of the anxieties they have, I never think like, oh, this is something that I have. And in fact, I'm more mindful of my own mental state, I think, through working with people with OCD, and it's kind of made me want to help them even more because I can't imagine what they're going through. Like it must be so difficult. And there are some people who are driven to suicide because of OCD, and I think it's terrible. Yeah.
On that note, do you have any thing you would like to say? Any that you could use this last few moments to share about your aspirations for your career or your research, how you want to bring it in the future?
So future goals, future career plans, I guess. Yeah, so I'm in my final year of my PhD now. I'm trying to submit by maybe end of this year. We'll see how feasible that is. And then I might stay, I've applied for some funding to stay on a bit longer to finish up some work I've done in Cambridge so that I can make my work publishable. So if I get that funding, then I'll stay a bit longer. And if not, I'll probably come back to Malaysia. And I'm quite interested in getting more teaching experience, maybe in a university, taking a break from research for a bit. But if I do end up in a research lab again, I wouldn't be too disappointed either because I do like what I'm doing.
And we need you to keep going on with this line of research. It's so important. And I'm personally quite interested on this as well. So on that note, as researchers, our profile is somewhat public. So if you're interested in our research, you can go on to Google things and check out and follow Aleya's research as it comes out, as she churns out her papers and whatnot, or tweets about her findings and all that. So you could check her out on Twitter or send her an email if you're interested in developing this line of thought and research or whatnot. Yeah, so we'll bring this to a close. Thank you everyone for staying with us for close to an hour. And yeah, we'll have another session of Research Insider next week. And this time it would be a neuroscientist again, with working with rats. Her name is Sarah Wong. She is researching how to improve intranasal administration of oxytocin. So that would be an interesting topic as well, because
that'll be really good.
It's the love hormone or social hormone. Yeah, we'll be interested to see what Sarah has to say, and this in the next round, Aleya will be the one who will be hosting.
Yeah, you'll see me again.
Yeah, we'll see Aleya again, and otherwise, see you next time.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.